They say a woman scorned is dangerous. But what about a woman who built an empire in secret, only to discover her husband plans to bury her alive in an asylum to keep it? Lady Alara Vance had 14 hours until her own husband signed the papers that would erase her from existence. Not divorce, not exile. Imprisonment. She'd spent 5 years engineering his rise to power from the shadows. Every military victory, every political maneuver, every impossible negotiation bore her invisible fingerprints. And now, standing in the corridor outside his study, she heard him laughing with his mistress about how simple it would be to have her declared mad. That's when the victim died, and the strategist was born. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey goes. The rain started just before midnight, which Alara considered either an omen or a convenience. She stood at the window of her dressing room, watching water streak the glass in jagged patterns, and thought about timing. Everything in her life had come down to timing, the precise moment to speak, to smile, to disappear into the background so thoroughly that people forgot she was there at all. Tonight required different timing. She turned from the window and studied her reflection in the standing mirror. The woman looking back wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her dark hair pinned in the elaborate style expected of a duchess, pearls at her throat, diamonds at her ears. The costume was perfect. It always had been. "My lady, the carriage is ready." The maid, young, nervous, new, hovered in the doorway. Alara had learned all their names in the first week, learned their routines in the second, learned which ones reported to her husband in the third. This girl, Margot, wasn't a spy, just scared of losing her position. "Thank you. I'll only be a moment." When the door closed, Alara moved to her writing desk and removed a small leather journal from the false bottom of the lowest drawer. The cipher ledger. 5 years of notes, observations, and strategic calculations written in a code only she understood. Well, she and one other person, but he didn't know she existed. She'd started keeping it the first month of her marriage, when she realized the Duke couldn't read a military map to save his life. He'd been pacing his study, sweating over a territorial dispute with the northern provinces, and she'd glanced at the document spread across his desk while bringing him tea. "The Western approach," she'd said quietly. He'd looked up, irritated. "What? If you move the battalion to the Western approach instead of reinforcing the eastern border, they'll have to split their forces. The terrain favors a smaller, faster unit there." 20 minutes later, he'd presented the exact strategy to his generals as his own idea. It won him a commendation and his first real recognition at court. She'd never brought him tea again. Instead, she began leaving notes. Anonymous suggestions slipped into his correspondence, strategic adjustments hidden in the household accounts, coded messages embedded in guest lists for state dinners. Every success he claimed, every brilliant maneuver that built his reputation, she'd engineered them all from the margins of his life. And he'd never once questioned where his sudden genius came from. Alara tucked the ledger into a hidden pocket sewn into her cloak. Then she added the cipher key, a separate document that would prove beyond doubt that every strategy the Duke had executed in 5 years originated from her hand. Without it, the ledger was just gibberish. With it, his entire legacy became a forgery. She descended the main staircase slowly, one gloved hand trailing the banister. The household was in controlled chaos preparing for the solstice ball, the event of the season, hosted by Duke Nathaniel Vance himself. 200 guests, an orchestra, champagne fountains, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the public spectacle of a powerful man honoring his beautiful young mistress while his wife smiled politely from the margins. Alara had attended this performance for 3 years running. She knew her role. Lady Vance. The Duke's chief steward materialized at the base of the stairs, his expression professionally neutral. "His Grace requests you delay your departure. He wishes to speak with you before the ball." Her pulse didn't change. Her smile didn't falter. "Of course. Where shall I find him?" "The blue drawing room, my lady." She found Nathaniel standing by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a folded letter in the other. He was handsome in the way men of privilege often were. Tall, well-dressed, features arranged in an expression of permanent confidence. At 38, he'd achieved everything a man of his station could want: title, wealth, influence, and the adoration of a society that believed brilliance was his birthright. He glanced up when she entered. "Alara, Close the door. She did, then waited. She'd learned early that silence was its own kind of power. I've been reviewing the household accounts, he said. There are discrepancies. Discrepancies? Expenditures that don't align with the expected costs of running the estate. He set down his glass with deliberate care. Large ones. Alara folded her hands. I'd be happy to review them with you. Which months are you concerned about? All of them. His eyes fixed on her with something that might have been suspicion or might have been performative authority. I'm beginning to wonder if you've been using estate funds for personal purposes. She let the accusation hang there for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the library renovation you approved last spring cost £8,000 more than the initial estimate. The marble you wanted shipped from Italy required additional transport fees. I documented everything. I approved no such. March 14th, you signed the authorization after the dinner with Lord Ashford. You were distracted by his proposal regarding the coastal trade routes. She paused. The ones I suggested you pursue, which have since tripled your quarterly revenue from the port holdings. His jaw tightened. She watched him remember, not the signature, but the success that had followed. The praise from the king. The appointment to the Trade Council. Nevertheless, he said slowly, I think it's time we implemented additional oversight. I'll be assigning Mr. Garrett to review all household expenditures going forward. You'll submit receipts and justifications for any purchases over £50. Translation. He was cutting off her access to resources, restricting her ability to move freely within the systems she'd built. As you wish, Alara said. Good. He picked up his bourbon again. The matter apparently settled in his mind. One more thing. I've invited Dr. Whitmore to join us at the ball tonight. Dr. Elias Whitmore, physician to the royal family, specialist in disorders of the mind. Alara's hands stayed perfectly still. How thoughtful. Is someone unwell? I've been concerned about you. Nathaniel's voice softened into something that might have passed for care if she didn't know him better. You've seemed distracted lately, withdrawn. I thought it might be wise to have someone evaluate your well-being. I'm quite well. Even so, he smiled. Humor me. She understood then with perfect clarity what was happening. He wasn't worried about her. He was building a case. Witnesses who would testify to her erratic behavior, her strange moods, her unsuitability for public life. Dr. Whitmore wouldn't find her unwell tonight, but over time, with enough coaching, with enough careful documentation, he could be convinced to sign the papers that mattered, the ones that would declare her incompetent, dangerous to herself, in need of institutional care. Alara had seen it happen to other women. Inconvenient wives whose husbands wanted freedom without scandal. They disappeared into private hospitals with quiet efficiency, their property transferred to male guardians, their voices legally silenced. She'd never imagined it would happen to her. I appreciate your concern, she said. Shall I meet you at the ball, or would you prefer we arrive together, separately? I have business to attend to first. He turned back to the window, dismissing her. She made it to her carriage before her hands started shaking. The ride to the Ashford estate took 40 minutes. Alara used 30 of them to regain control of her breathing and 10 to revise every assumption she'd made about her timeline. She'd known the marriage was over, had known for 2 years since the night she'd walked in on Nathaniel with Lady Charlotte Brennan in the conservatory. She hadn't cared about the affair. Their marriage had been a political arrangement from the start, affection never part of the contract. What had stung was the way he'd looked at her, not guilty, not apologetic, but annoyed at the interruption. She'd left them to it and started planning her exit. Slowly, carefully. Gathering resources, establishing contacts, creating the kind of financial independence that would let her walk away clean when the time came. But this was different. This wasn't divorce or separation. This was erasure. The carriage stopped. Alara stepped out into a courtyard blazing with torchlight, her expression composed, her panic locked somewhere beneath her ribs where no one could see it. The Ashford mansion swallowed her into its glittering chaos. Music poured from the ballroom. Champagne circulated on silver trays. Women in silk and men in evening dress moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to be there. Alara found Lady Ashford near the refreshment table, holding court with a group of younger women. Alara, darling, Margaret Ashford kissed both her cheeks with theatrical warmth. "You look absolutely radiant. Doesn't she, girls?" The girls agreed with the kind of enthusiasm that meant they'd already noticed the Duke's absence and drawn their own conclusions. "Is Nathaniel not joining us?" Margaret asked, her sympathy razor-sharp. "He'll be along shortly. Business matter." "Of course." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Well, you simply must try the oysters. They're divine." Alara accepted a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink and drifted toward the edges of the room. She needed to be seen, needed witnesses who could place her here, mingling normally, behaving exactly as expected, but she also needed to watch. Dr. Whitmore arrived 20 minutes later. She spotted him immediately, silver-haired, austere, moving through the crowd with the self-importance of a man whose professional opinion could destroy lives. He greeted the Duke like an old friend. They spoke for less than 5 minutes. Then Nathaniel's gaze swept the room, found her, and he gestured for her to join them. Alara moved through the crowd with the graceful inevitability of a woman walking toward her own execution. "Alara, you remember Dr. Whitmore?" Nathaniel said. "Of course. Doctor." She extended her hand. Whitmore took it, his touch clinical. "Lady Vance, lovely to see you again. The pleasure is mine. I was just telling the Duke about a fascinating case I've been following," Whitmore said. "A woman of considerable intellect who began experiencing episodes of paranoia and delusion, quite convinced that people were conspiring against her. Tragic, really. She'd been perfectly sound before the onset." Alara smiled. "How terrible. Was she helped?" "She's receiving excellent care at a private facility. Peace and quiet, away from the stresses that triggered her condition." His gaze held hers just a fraction too long. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone suffering is remove them from the situations that cause them harm. "Indeed," Alara said softly. Nathaniel's hand settled on her lower back, possessive, performative. "Darling, Dr. Whitmore was kind enough to offer to check in on you this week. Just a friendly consultation." "That won't be necessary." "I insist." Nathaniel's fingers pressed harder. "Your health is important to me." Around them, the ball continued its glittering rotation. No one was listening. No one cared. A husband concerned for his wife's well-being, what could be more natural? Alara met Whitmore's eyes and saw exactly what he was. A man who'd built a career on making inconvenient women disappear. "Perhaps next week," she said. "I have several engagements this week that I'd hate to miss." "Of course," Whitmore inclined his head. "I'll have my secretary contact you." The conversation shifted to safer topics. The weather, the quality of the orchestra, the upcoming racing season. Alara participated with mechanical precision, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She had less time than she'd thought, maybe days, maybe hours. When she finally excused herself to the powder room, she didn't go there. Instead, she slipped through a side corridor she'd mapped during a previous visit, down a servant's staircase and out into the garden. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and gleaming. She found a bench hidden behind a hedge of night-blooming jasmine and sat down to think. The original plan, the careful, methodical extraction she'd been engineering for months, was obsolete. She'd intended to wait until she had enough leverage, enough resources, enough distance to leave on her own terms. But Nathaniel wasn't giving her that time. He was moving faster than she'd anticipated, which meant he was either more threatened by her than she'd realized, or someone had advised him to act quickly. Either way, she couldn't wait. She pulled the cipher ledger from her cloak and studied it in the moonlight. 5 years of evidence, proof that every strategic decision credited to the Duke of Vance had originated with his invisible wife. Military campaigns, trade negotiations, political alliances, all of it engineered by a woman the world barely noticed. The ledger alone wouldn't save her, not if she was locked in an asylum before she could use it, but it was leverage, proof, insurance. She needed 3 things: safety, documentation, and a platform. Somewhere she could go that Nathaniel couldn't reach her, someone who could verify her claims, and a way to make the truth public enough that it couldn't be buried. Hiding from your own party? Alara's head snapped up. A man stood at the edge of the path, younger than her, maybe 25, dressed in evening clothes that were expensive but slightly rumpled. He had the kind of face that suggested chronic insomnia and too much thinking, sharp features, dark eyes, an expression caught between curiosity and exhaustion. "I needed air," she said carefully. "Fair enough. It's suffocating in there." He gestured vaguely toward the mansion. All that performance, everyone pretending they give a damn about anything except who's sleeping with who and who's going bankrupt next quarter. Despite everything, Alara felt a flicker of amusement. "You're not a fan of society events." "I'm a fan of honesty. Society events are the opposite." He tilted his head, studying her. "You're the Duke of Vance's wife." "I am." "Interesting. Why?" "Because you're significantly more intelligent than him, which means either you're very good at hiding it or he's very good at ignoring it." He paused. "I'm guessing both." Alara stared at him. "Who are you?" "Julian Graves. I work for the Foreign Office, Cryptography Division." He said it without pride, just fact. "I've been watching your husband's career with academic interest. His strategic analyses are impressive. Too impressive, actually. They display a level of sophistication that doesn't match his educational background or prior work. I've been trying to figure out where he's getting them." Her heart kicked against her ribs. And then I watched you at dinner 3 months ago at the Pembridge affair. You corrected an error in Lord Pembridge's assessment of the Iberian trade routes, very subtly, made it seem like you were just asking a question. Your husband picked up the correction, rephrased it, and presented it as his own analysis. Pembridge was impressed. Your husband got invited to join the King's Advisory Council. Julian's smile was thin. "You didn't seem surprised." Alara considered her options. Denial was useless. This man had already seen too much. Engagement was dangerous. Silence was probably wisest. "What do you want?" she asked. "The same thing you do, I suspect." "The truth." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "I don't care about your marriage, but I do care about national security, and right now the king is taking strategic advice from a man who can't tell a military formation from a garden party. If that advice is actually coming from someone competent, I need to know who, and I need to know why they're hiding." "You think I'm a threat. I think you're an anomaly, and anomalies are either disasters waiting to happen or assets being wasted." His gaze held hers. "Which are you?" She should have walked away, should have returned to the ball, played her role, kept her head down. But something in his directness, the absence of performance, the clarity of purpose, made her reckless. "If I were to tell you that every strategic decision the Duke has made in the last 5 years came from me," she said quietly, "what would you do with that information?" Julian didn't look surprised. "Verify it, then probably offer you a job." "And if I told you he's planning to have me declared insane and institutionalized to prevent me from ever proving it?" Now he looked surprised. "Is he?" "Yes." "When?" "Soon. Days, maybe." Julian was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "What do you need?" The question was so unexpected, so starkly practical that Alara almost laughed. "I don't even know you." "No. But I know you're the person who's been keeping this country's strategic interests intact for 5 years without credit or compensation. And I know that if you disappear into an asylum, we're all substantially worse off." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to her. "Foreign Office, Cryptography Division. We have resources, and we have jurisdiction over matters of national security, which this qualifies as, if you can prove your claims." Alara looked at the card, then at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because I don't like waste, and letting someone with your capabilities vanish because her husband's an insecure mediocrity is a colossal waste." He paused. "Also, I really don't like people who abuse institutional power to silence inconvenient women. It's lazy and unimaginative." Despite everything, the fear, the pressure, the impossible situation, Alara smiled. "You're very strange. I get that a lot." He stepped back. "Think about it. If you decide you need help, use that card. If not, I'll pretend we never spoke." He walked back toward the mansion, leaving her alone with the jasmine and the moonlight and a small rectangle of cardstock that might be a lifeline or might be another trap. Alara stayed in the garden for 10 more minutes, thinking. Then she returned to the ball, smiled at the right people, made the right small talk, and left at precisely the moment when her absence would seem natural rather than suspicious. The carriage took her home. She dismissed the driver, climbed the stairs to her chambers, and locked the door. Then she opened her traveling case and began, very carefully, to pack. Not everything. That would be noticed. Just the essentials: documents, currency, the cipher ledger, 2 changes of clothes, and the small pistol she'd purchased 6 months ago and never told anyone about. At 3 in the morning, she heard Nathaniel return. His footsteps in the corridor, the slam of his study door. Voices. He'd brought someone with him. Lady Charlotte, probably. Alara laid out her dress for tomorrow, brushed her hair, and climbed into bed. To anyone watching, she was simply a duchess retiring after a long evening. But beneath the covers, still fully clothed, she was running calculations. 14 hours until Nathaniel's meeting with Dr. Whitmore. 36 hours until the signed commitment papers could be processed. 48 hours until she could be legally detained. She had 2 days to disappear, or she'd lose the ability to disappear at all. The rain started again just before dawn. Alara listened to it hammer the windows and thought about timing. Everything came down to timing, and hers had just run out. She woke to the sound of breaking glass. For half a second, Alara thought she'd imagined it, some fragment of a nightmare bleeding into dawn. Then she heard voices in the corridor below. Men's voices. Unfamiliar. She was out of bed before conscious thought caught up, her hand already reaching for the traveling case she'd hidden behind the wardrobe. Her fingers found the pistol first. Cold metal. Real. The voices grew louder. Footsteps on the main staircase. Alara crossed to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. 2 men, maybe 3. Speaking in low, clipped tones that suggested military training or worse. One of them laughed, brief, humorless. "Check the east wing first. He said she might run." Her blood went cold. He said she might run. Nathaniel had sent them, which meant he wasn't waiting for Dr. Whitmore's official diagnosis, wasn't bothering with the careful theater of legal commitment. He was moving now, in the dark, with men who wouldn't ask questions. The plan she'd spent all night refining, the measured withdrawal, the careful gathering of evidence, the controlled exit, dissolved like smoke. She had minutes, maybe less. Alara grabbed the traveling case, threw her cloak over her nightdress, and ran for the servants' passage hidden behind the north wall panel. She'd discovered it her 2nd month in the house, had memorized every turn and exit in case she ever needed to move through the manor unseen. That paranoia, that ridiculous overcaution, was about to save her life. The passage was narrow and pitch black. She felt her way along the walls, counting doorways. 1, 2, 3. At the 4th, she heard someone enter her bedroom. "She's not here." Check the dressing room, the bath. Footsteps, the sound of doors being thrown open, furniture scraping across floor. "Nothing. She's already gone." "Then find her." Alara kept moving. The passage dumped her out near the kitchens, which should have been empty this early, but she could hear movement. The cook. Of course. The woman rose before dawn every day to start bread. She couldn't go that way. She backtracked, took the South Fork, and emerged in the conservatory. Glass walls on 3 sides, exposed to anyone looking, but the garden beyond offered cover if she could reach it. She crossed the space in 15 seconds that felt like an hour, pushed through the exterior door, and nearly collided with a figure standing in the shadows. Her hand went to the pistol. Then she recognized him. Julian Graves looked like he hadn't slept. Same rumpled clothes from the ball, now rain-damp and mud-spattered. He held a lantern in one hand and something that might have been a knife in the other. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question. "How did you—" "I stayed. Watched the house." He gestured toward the east gate. 3 men arrived 20 minutes ago. Professional, armed. They're not here to talk." Alara stared at him. "You stayed? All night?" "I told you I don't like waste." He extinguished the lantern. "Come on. I have a carriage 2 streets over." You don't know me. You don't trust me. You think this might be another trap." He met her eyes. "You're right to think that. But right now your options are come with me or get caught by whoever your husband hired. Choose fast." Behind her, inside the house, someone shouted. Alara chose. They ran. Julian moved like someone who'd done this before. Quick, efficient, staying to the shadows. He led her through the garden, over a low wall, and into a narrow alley that stank of refuse and wet stone. The carriage was exactly where he'd said it would be. Unmarked, driver already in position. "Get in," Julian said. She did. He climbed in after her and rapped twice on the ceiling. The carriage lurched forward. Alara pressed herself into the corner, breathing hard, still gripping the pistol. "Where are we going?" Somewhere safe, temporarily. Julian glanced out the window. We have maybe an hour before your husband realizes you're gone and starts looking properly. I need to know what you have that's worth killing you over. I never said he was trying to kill me. You don't hire men like that for a conversation. He turned back to her. What do you have? She could still refuse. Could demand he let her out, find her own way, trust no one. But the truth was she needed help, and Julian Graves had just proven he was willing to risk something to provide it. Alara pulled the cipher ledger from her case. 5 years of military and political strategy, she said. Every decision the Duke made that built his reputation. All of it coded, all of it mine. Julian took the ledger carefully, like it might explode. He opened it, scanned a few pages, and went very still. This is real. Yes. You can prove it? I have the cipher key, and I can replicate the analysis in front of witnesses if needed. She paused. The code is based on a modified Vigenère cipher with a rotating key structure. No one else knows it exists. He looked up at her, something like awe crossing his face. You built this entire system. I had a lot of time and very little else to do. Can I see the key? She hesitated, then handed over the second document. Julian studied both in silence for a long moment, his expression shifting from skepticism to concentration to something that looked almost like anger. He really took credit for all of this, he said finally. Every word. And you let him. I didn't have a choice. The words came out sharper than she intended. I was 18 when we married. I had no money, no family, no legal standing. Anything I created belonged to him automatically. If I'd claimed it openly, he could have had me committed then. Or worse. Julian closed the ledger. I'm sorry. Don't be. I knew what I was doing. She met his eyes. I just didn't expect him to try to bury me when he was done using me. The carriage turned onto a wider street. Through the window, Alara could see the city waking. Shopkeepers opening shutters, street vendors setting up carts. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a Duchess was fleeing through their midst. The Foreign Office, Julian said slowly. If you're willing to testify, we can protect you, and we can use this. He tapped the ledger. We've been relying on your husband's analysis for strategic decisions. If that analysis actually came from you, and if you're willing to continue providing it, that changes everything. You want to hire me. I want to stop wasting your abilities. And I want to make sure the person advising the king on military matters actually knows what they're talking about. He paused. Also, yes, I want to hire you, properly, with salary, title, and legal protection. It was the most surreal job offer Alara had ever received, delivered in a rattling carriage while fleeing her husband's hired thugs. She almost laughed. And what about Nathaniel? What about him? He's a duke. He has influence, connections, money. You think your office will protect me from that? I think my office answers to the king, who values competent intelligence over aristocratic egos. And I think once we demonstrate that the Duke of Vance has been committing fraud, taking credit for strategic work he didn't do, potentially compromising national security in the process, his influence will be substantially reduced. Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe it could be that simple. But she'd spent 5 years watching powerful men protect each other, watching women disappear when they became inconvenient. He'll say I'm insane, she said. That's his plan. Dr. Whitmore will testify that I've had episodes, delusions. Society will believe him because they always believe men like him. Then we don't fight it in society. We fight it in the courts. Julian leaned forward. You're not just a duchess. You're a strategic asset. If we can prove you created this work, the Foreign Office has jurisdiction. We can claim you are operating under our authority, which makes any attempt to detain you interference with Crown business. That's a lie. It's a technicality, and right now technicalities are your best weapon. The carriage stopped. Julian glanced out, then nodded. We're here. Here turned out to be a narrow townhouse in a district Alara didn't recognize, respectable but not fashionable. The kind of place that attracted lawyers and minor bureaucrats, people who worked for a living. Julian helped her down. The driver disappeared without a word. Safe house, Julian explained, unlocking the door. The office keeps a few scattered around the city for situations like this. You have a lot of situations like this? More than you'd think. Inside, the house was spare but clean. A sitting room, a small kitchen, stairs leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. No personal effects. Nothing that would identify who lived here or why. Julian locked the door behind them, then moved through the rooms, checking windows, drawing curtains. Professional. Thorough. "There's food in the kitchen," he said. "Not much, but enough for a few days if needed. Bedroom upstairs, first door on the left. I'll take the second room." "You're staying?" "Until I'm sure you're secure, yes." He met her gaze. "I meant what I said. You're an asset, and I don't leave assets unprotected." Elara sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was draining away, leaving only the crushing weight of what she'd just done. She'd fled her home, abandoned her life, put herself in the hands of a man she barely knew, trusting that his interest in her intelligence was stronger than his loyalty to the systems that would want her silenced. "What happens now?" she asked. Julian pulled off his coat, tossed it over a chair. "Now I go to my office and start building your case. I'll need documentation. Anything you have that proves the work is yours. Drafts, notes, earlier versions of the strategies before your husband presented them. The more evidence, the better." "I have copies. Hidden." She'd been careful about that, had created a secondary archive of her work stored in 3 separate locations around the city. Insurance she'd never expected to need. "Good. I'll retrieve them. You stay here, keep the doors locked. Don't answer for anyone except me." He paused. "Can you shoot that pistol, or is it for show?" "I can shoot it. Have you ever shot anyone?" "No." "Hope you don't have to." He grabbed his coat again. "I'll be back before dark. If anyone comes to the door before then, don't engage. Just go out the back window. There's a rope ladder in the upstairs closet." "You really have done this before?" "Once or twice." He stopped at the door. "Lady Vance, Elara, I know this is terrifying. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I promise you I'm better at this than your husband is at strategy. And I don't lose." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in a strange house with a loaded pistol and a ledger that might save her life or end it. Elara sat very still for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the walls. Carts rattling, voices calling, the ordinary chaos of people going about their ordinary lives. Then she stood, checked the locks, and went upstairs to plan her next move. She couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, Nathaniel would find her. Men like him always did. But if she could get her evidence into the right hands, if she could prove what she'd done before he could silence her, she might have a chance. The bedroom was small but comfortable. A bed, a desk, a wardrobe. She set her traveling case on the desk and began laying out her resources. The cipher ledger, the key, 300 pounds in currency, the pistol, a list of contacts, people she'd helped over the years, people who might remember a quiet Duchess offering subtle advice that had saved their careers. She pulled paper from the desk drawer and began to write. Not a letter, a deposition, a complete account of every strategy she'd created, every decision she'd engineered, every moment of invisible work that had built the Duke of Vance's reputation. She wrote for hours. The light changed from gray dawn to pale morning to hard noon. Her hand cramped. She kept writing. At some point she heard footsteps on the street outside. She froze, listening. The steps passed, continued, faded. She kept writing. By the time Julian returned, she had 40 pages of testimony, cross-referenced with dates, witnesses, and strategic outcomes. Proof that wouldn't require anyone to believe her word against her husband's. Just proof that required them to look at the evidence. Julian read the first 10 pages in silence. Then he looked up. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "It's the truth. I know." He set the pages down carefully. "I brought someone. She's waiting outside. I think you should meet her." Elara's hand moved toward the pistol. "Who?" "Her name is Victoria Ashford. She's Lord Ashford's sister. She works for the Foreign Office, Intelligence Division. She's also one of the most connected women in London, and she's been fighting for years to get women into positions of real authority." He paused. "And she hates your husband." "Why?" "Because he took credit for a trade analysis she wrote 3 years ago, presented it as his own work. She couldn't prove it without destroying her brother's relationship with the Duke, so she stayed silent. But she's never forgotten." Elara remembered Victoria Ashford, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, moving through society gatherings with the ease of someone who knew exactly how much power she had and exactly how little credit she'd receive for using it. "Bring her in," Alara said. Victoria Ashford entered like she owned the place. Tall, perhaps 40, dressed in a severe gray suit that made her look like a headmistress about to deliver very bad news. She studied Alara with the kind of assessment that saw past clothes and titles straight to capability. "Lady Vance," she said. "Miss Ashford. Julian tells me you've been running your husband's strategic operations for 5 years. Yes? And you can prove it." "Yes." Victoria pulled off her gloves. "Good. Because I've been waiting a long time for someone to expose Nathaniel Vance for the fraud he is, and I'd very much like to help you destroy him." The venom in her voice was almost shocking. Alara glanced at Julian, who just shrugged. "I mentioned she hates him," he said. "You mentioned." Alara turned back to Victoria. "What are you proposing?" Victoria sat, crossed her legs, and smiled. "Total war. We expose every strategy he's claimed as his own. We prove you created them. We document the fraud, present it to the King's Council, and watch his reputation burn." She paused. "And then we make sure every woman in this country knows that the great Duke of Vance was actually just a mediocre man standing on his wife's shoulders." It was vindictive. It was dangerous. It was exactly what Alara had been afraid to want. "He'll fight back," she said. "He'll use every resource he has." "Let him. We have resources too." Victoria leaned forward. "The Foreign Office. The Intelligence Division. A network of women who've been waiting for someone to prove that we're just as capable as the men who've been taking credit for our work. You're not alone in this, Lady Vance. You never were. You just didn't know where to look." Alara felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Everything. Your testimony, your evidence, your willingness to stand in front of the King's Council and say, out loud, that you created the work your husband claimed." Victoria's gaze was steady. "It won't be easy. They'll question you, doubt you, try to break your story. You'll need to be stronger than you've ever been." "I've been invisible for 5 years," Alara said quietly. "I think I can handle being seen." Victoria smiled. "Good. Then let's begin." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Victoria reviewed every page of Alara's testimony, asking sharp questions, poking holes in the narrative, forcing her to be more specific, more detailed, more precise. Julian cross-referenced the dates with official records, pulling files from the Foreign Office archives to prove that the strategies had actually been implemented, that they'd actually succeeded. By the time darkness fell, they had a case. Not perfect, not unassailable, but real. "We'll present this to the director tomorrow," Victoria said. "He'll want to interview you personally. If he's satisfied, he'll take it to the council by the end of the week. And if he's not satisfied, then we find another way." Victoria gathered her papers. "But he will be. I've worked with him for 10 years. He values results over politics. And your results speak for themselves." Julian walked her to the door. They spoke in low voices for a moment, then Victoria left. Julian locked the door behind her and turned back to Alara. "You should eat something. And sleep." "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. You'll need your strength." He was right, of course, but the thought of food made her stomach turn. Instead, she stood at the window, looking out at the darkened street, and tried to imagine what Nathaniel was doing right now. Raging, probably. Tearing apart the manor looking for clues, threatening the staff, calling in favors. He would be methodical about it. He'd learned that much from her, at least. He would map out her likely moves, anticipate her strategies, try to stay 3 steps ahead. But he'd be doing it with his own mind, his own limited, mediocre tactical sense. And that might be enough of an advantage. "He'll come for me," she said quietly. Julian joined her at the window. "I know. You can't protect me forever." "I don't need forever. I just need long enough to get you in front of the council." He paused. "After that, you'll be too valuable to disappear, an official asset, protected by Crown authority. Or I'll be a proven liar who tried to destroy her husband's reputation. Not if we do this right?" Alara turned to look at him. "Why are you doing this? Really? It can't just be about preventing waste." Julian was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother was brilliant. She could do mathematical calculations in her head that took other people hours with pen and paper. She tried to study engineering, but no university would accept her. So she married a man who promised to value her mind. And for a while, he did. His voice went flat. Then he started taking her ideas, presenting her solutions as his own. She tried to object. He had her committed for hysteria. She died in that institution 3 years later. Alara's breath caught. I was 12, Julian continued. Old enough to understand what was happening, not old enough to stop it. He met her eyes. So yes, it's personal. And yes, I'm going to help you. Because if I can stop what happened to her from happening to you, then maybe it meant something. Her brilliance, her life. I'm sorry, Alara whispered. Don't be. Just win. They stood together at the window, two people carrying different griefs toward the same goal, and watched the street for signs of danger. At midnight, a carriage stopped 3 houses down. 2 men got out. They didn't approach the safe house, just stood in the shadows, watching. We need to leave, Julian said quietly. Now? Now. He was already moving, grabbing coats, checking the back exit. Alara shoved her papers into the traveling case, her hands shaking. The men outside hadn't moved, just watching, waiting. They're not sure, Julian muttered. They know you're in this area, but they don't know which house. The moment they're certain, they'll move. How long do we have? Minutes. They went out the back window. Julian first, then Alara, lowering herself onto the rope ladder that hung into a narrow courtyard. Her nightdress caught on something, tore. She kept climbing. They hit the ground and ran. Behind them, she heard shouting. The men had seen them. Julian pulled her into an alley, then another, navigating the maze of back streets with the confidence of someone who'd memorized the layout. They emerged onto a wider avenue. He flagged down a cab. Where? The driver asked. Julian gave an address Alara didn't recognize. The cab lurched forward. Through the rear window, she saw the 2 men emerge from the alley. One of them was pointing. They saw us, she said. I know. Julian rapped on the ceiling. Faster! Double fare! The driver complied. The cab rattled through the empty streets, taking corners too fast, bouncing over cobblestones. Behind them, another cab appeared, following. They're not giving up, Alara said. Neither are we. This cab screeched to a stop in front of a building Alara recognized, the Foreign Office. Even at this hour, lights burned in several windows. Julian threw money at the driver and pulled Alara toward the entrance. The guards at the door recognized him, let them through without question. Inside, the halls were quieter, but not empty. Night staff, clerks working late, people who barely glanced at them as they passed. Julian led her up 3 flights of stairs and into an office at the end of a long corridor. He locked the door, crossed to the window, and looked out. They're circling the building, he said, but they won't come in. Not here. Alara sank into a chair, her heart hammering. What now? Now we don't leave until morning, and when we do, it's with an official escort. He turned to face her. I'm moving up the timeline. We meet with the director first thing tomorrow. No more waiting. I'm not ready. You're ready. You've been ready for 5 years. He moved to his desk, began pulling files. We present everything. The ledger, the testimony, the evidence. We ask for immediate protection and official recognition. And we pray the director sees what I see. Which is? That you're the most valuable intelligence asset this office has ever had the chance to recruit. He looked up. And that letting you disappear would be a betrayal of everything we're supposed to stand for. Outside, in the darkness, Nathaniel's men prowled. Inside, in the lamplight, Alara and Julian prepared for war. She didn't sleep. Spent the hours refining her testimony, anticipating questions, building her case with the precision she'd once used to build her husband's reputation. Dawn came gray and cold. Julian brought coffee, bread, cheese. They ate in silence. At 8 o'clock, the director arrived. His name was Edmund Price, and he looked exactly like someone who'd spent 40 years managing the kingdom's secrets. Gray hair, tired eyes, the bearing of a man who'd seen too much to be impressed by anything. He sat across from Alara and said, "Convince me." So she did. She walked him through 5 years of strategy, showed him the cipher ledger, the key, the testimony, explained how she'd created each analysis, each decision, each tactical recommendation, proved that she understood not just what had been done, but why it had worked, what the alternatives would have been, what the long-term consequences were. She spoke for 90 minutes without pause. When she finished, Director Price was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your husband is a fool." Relief hit her like a wave. "Sir?" "Anyone who had access to a mind like yours and chose to waste it in silence is a fool." He stood. "Miss Ashford will escort you to protective custody. Mr. Graves will begin documentation for official recruitment, and I will personally present your case to the King's Council this afternoon." "You believe me?" "I've read every strategic analysis the Duke of Vance has submitted, and I've read yours." He smiled grimly. "Only one of you understands what you're talking about. The question now is what we do about it. What do you recommend?" "Exposure, accountability, and making sure every person in this kingdom understands that intellectual fraud is still fraud, regardless of title." He paused. "Are you prepared for what comes next? The scrutiny, the doubt, the backlash from people who won't want to believe a woman could do what you've done?" Alara thought about 5 years of silence. 5 years of watching someone else take credit for her mind. 5 years of making herself invisible because visibility meant danger. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared." Director Price nodded. "Then let's end this." The council chamber smelled like old wood and older money. Alara stood in the center of a semicircle of men who'd spent their entire lives being listened to and tried not to think about how badly this could go wrong. There were 12 of them. She recognized most by reputation. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, who'd built his career on never taking a position until he knew which side would win. General Hawthorne, whose tactical decisions in the Northern campaign had been praised as genius, decisions she'd written. Sir Frederick Marsh, the King's chief financial advisor, whose restructuring of the trade tariffs had saved the Treasury millions. Her work again. They looked at her like she was an interesting problem. Not a person. A problem. Director Price stood to her right, steady as granite. Julian was somewhere behind her. She couldn't see him but felt his presence like a promise. "Gentlemen," Price began, "I've brought you evidence of systematic intellectual fraud committed by Duke Nathaniel Vance over the past 5 years. Evidence that suggests every major strategic decision attributed to him was, in fact, created by his wife." The murmuring started immediately. Pemberton's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Hawthorne leaned forward, interested. Marsh just looked annoyed, like this was wasting his time. "That's a serious accusation," Pemberton said carefully. "It's a provable one." Price gestured to Alara. "Lady Vance has provided documentation, testimony, and the ability to replicate her analytical process in real time. I've reviewed the evidence myself. It's credible." "Credible from your perspective," Marsh cut in. "But you're asking us to believe that a woman, no offense intended, my lady, created military and economic strategies that have shaped kingdom policy. Strategies that some of the brightest minds in this room struggled to fully comprehend." "No offense taken," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And yes, that's exactly what I'm asking you to believe." Silence, heavy and evaluating. Then Hawthorne spoke, his voice gravelly from decades of shouting commands across battlefields. "The Northern Campaign, the tactical withdrawal that drew Baron Wessex into the Valley ambush, that was 3 years ago. The Duke presented that strategy personally." "I know," Alara said. "I wrote it 2 weeks before he presented it. I can show you the original notes, including the 3 alternative approaches I considered and rejected." "Why would you reject them?" "The first relied on reinforcements that weren't available within the necessary time frame. The second assumed supply lines that hadn't been secured. The third would have worked but cost too many lives for the strategic value gained." She paused. "The Duke presented the fourth option because it was the only one that balanced resource constraints with acceptable risk." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "What were the terrain considerations?" "The valley floor was soft ground, recent rain. Heavy cavalry would bog down. Infantry could move faster and had better sight lines from the ridge positions. The Baron's forces were cavalry-heavy, which made them vulnerable once contained." She met his gaze. "I recommended light infantry with longbow support. That's what the Duke ordered." "Anyone could have learned that from the after-action reports. The reports don't mention that I also recommended placing a reserve unit 3 miles east in case Wessex broke through the primary line. He didn't. But if he had, we would have caught him at the river crossing." Alara pulled a paper from her folder. Here's my original sketch, dated 14 days before the battle. The reserve position isn't in any official record because it was never activated. She handed the paper to Director Price, who passed it to Hawthorne. The general studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. This is detailed, he said finally. I don't do anything halfway, General. Marsh shifted in his seat. Let's say, hypothetically, that we believe you created one strategy. That doesn't prove you created all of them. Collaboration between spouses isn't uncommon. Perhaps you offered suggestions, and the Duke developed them further. Perhaps. Alara pulled out another document. Here's the trade tariff restructuring you implemented last year, Sir Frederick. The analysis that convinced you to shift the taxation burden from raw imports to finished goods, thereby incentivizing domestic manufacturing while maintaining revenue. Marsh stiffened. I remember the analysis. Do you remember the section on secondary market impacts? The prediction that shifting the tariff structure would create a temporary shortage of imported tools, which would drive up prices for craftsmen, which would require a 6-month subsidy program to prevent economic disruption in the manufacturing sector. The Duke mentioned that possibility. Did he mention the specific subsidy structure, the amount, the distribution timeline, the qualifying criteria? Alara slid another paper across the table. Because I designed all of that. In detail. 2 months before implementation. Marsh took the paper. Read it. His jaw tightened. This is verbatim from the final policy document, he said quietly. I know, because I wrote the final policy document. Your office received it with the Duke's seal, but the handwriting in the margins, the calculations, the notes, that's mine. You can compare it to any other sample of my writing. Pemberton cleared his throat. Lady Vance, even if we accept that you contributed to these strategies, that's not the same as creating them wholesale. Marriage is a partnership. Intellectual collaboration is not what happened here. Alara's voice cut through his careful diplomacy. I didn't collaborate with my husband, Lord Pemberton. I created strategies in secret, encoded them to protect my work, and left them where he would find them because I knew he'd take credit. And he did. Every single time. For 5 years. Why? The question came from the far end of the table, Lord Ashford, Victoria's brother. He'd been silent until now. If you're as brilliant as this evidence suggests, why hide? Why not demand recognition? Because I'm a woman, Alara said flatly. And women who demand recognition for intellectual work are either ignored, dismissed as hysterical, or, as my husband was planning, declared insane and institutionalized. The room went very quiet. That's a serious accusation, Pemberton said again, but his voice had lost its careful neutrality. It's a true one. The Duke hired Dr. Elias Whitmore to evaluate my mental state. The plan was to have me declared incompetent and committed to private care. She looked at each man in turn. I ran because the alternative was losing my freedom permanently. Not because I did anything wrong, because I knew too much and had become inconvenient. Director Price stepped forward. Dr. Whitmore's preliminary evaluation has been obtained. It suggests Lady Vance displays signs of delusion and paranoia. However, when we interviewed the doctor directly, he admitted he'd never actually examined her. His assessment was based entirely on the Duke's descriptions of her behavior. That's not proper medical protocol, Marsh said sharply. No, it's not. But it is sufficient for a legal commitment if no one questions the process. Price's voice was hard. Which brings us to why we're here. Lady Vance isn't just alleging fraud. She's alleging systematic suppression of her intellectual work combined with planned illegal detention. This isn't a domestic dispute, it's a matter of national security. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, studying Alara with new intensity. You said you can replicate your analytical process. Prove it. How? There's a tactical situation developing on the eastern border, skirmishes with Valdoria. Small scale now, but potentially escalating. Our current assessment suggests holding defensive positions and waiting for diplomatic resolution. He pulled a map from the stack of papers in front of him and slid it across the table. Tell me if we're wrong. Alara picked up the map, studied it for 30 seconds. You're wrong, she said. Explain. Your defensive positions assume Valdoria wants territory. They don't. They want to test response time and coordination between our border units. Every skirmish has been against a different sector. They're mapping our defensive capabilities. She traced a line across the map. The next attack will be here, at the river crossing, because it's the weakest point in your coverage. They'll hit it hard, draw reinforcements from the adjacent positions, and then probe those weakened areas for vulnerabilities. How do you know that? Because it's what I would do. She looked up. You're defending territory. They're gathering intelligence. Different objectives require different strategies. So what would you recommend? Reinforce the river crossing, but do it quietly. Don't make it obvious you've identified the weakness. When they attack, let them think they're succeeding, then close the trap from both sides. Capture their advance unit intact. You'll get better intelligence from prisoners than from bodies. And more importantly, you'll demonstrate that you can predict their moves, which changes the psychological dynamic. Hawthorne's expression shifted from skeptical to thoughtful. That's aggressive. It's effective. Defense is important, but if you want to stop the skirmishes, you need to make them too costly to continue. She set down the map. Will it work? Yes. Will it risk more casualties in the short term? Possibly, but it ends the problem instead of managing it indefinitely. The general exchanged a look with Director Price. Something unspoken passed between them. The Duke's assessment recommended maintaining defensive positions indefinitely, Hawthorne said slowly. He called aggressive action premature and risky. The Duke doesn't understand the difference between caution and paralysis. Alara's voice was cold. He never has. Pemberton stood abruptly. I need to consult with my colleagues, privately. Of course. Price gestured to the door. We'll wait outside. Julian materialized at Alara's elbow, guiding her out of the chamber. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. The hallway was empty except for Victoria, who'd been pacing near the windows. She stopped when she saw Alara's face. How bad? Victoria asked. I don't know. Alara's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her sides, willing them still. They listened. Some of them believed me, but I can't tell if that's enough. It's enough, Julian said firmly. You were brilliant in there. I was desperate in there. She looked at him. What if they decide the disruption of exposing the Duke isn't worth it? What if they'd rather maintain the status quo and quietly suppress the evidence? Then we leak it, Victoria said. We take it to the press, publish the cipher ledger, make it too public to bury. That's treason, Alara said. So is what they'd be doing. Victoria's eyes were fierce. You don't surrender now, not after coming this far. Before Alara could respond, the chamber doors opened. Director Price appeared. They want to see you again, he said. Alara walked back into the room feeling like she was walking toward a cliff edge. The council members had rearranged themselves, some standing now, others still seated. The energy had shifted. Something had been decided. Pemberton spoke first. Lady Vance, this council has reviewed your evidence and heard your testimony. We have 3 questions before we reach our final determination. I'll answer what I can. First, if we grant you official recognition and protection, will you continue to provide strategic analysis to this council and the Crown? Yes. Second, are you prepared to testify publicly, if necessary, to the truth of your claims? Understanding that such testimony will destroy your husband's reputation and likely your own social standing? Alara thought about the life she'd built in the margins, the careful invisibility, the safety of silence. Yes, she said. Third, Pemberton's voice softened slightly. Are you certain this is what you want? Once we move forward, there's no undoing it. The Duke will fight back with every resource at his disposal. Your life will never be private again. You'll be scrutinized, questioned, doubted. Some people will never believe you. They'll call you a liar, an opportunist, a woman who destroyed her husband out of spite. I know. And you're still willing to proceed? Alara met his eyes. Lord Pemberton, I've spent 5 years being invisible. I've had my work stolen, my intelligence dismissed, my autonomy threatened. I've been planned around, talked over, and erased from every success I engineered. And when I became inconvenient, my own husband tried to have me imprisoned for the rest of my life. Her voice didn't shake. So yes, I'm certain. Because the alternative is disappearing, and I'm done disappearing. Silence filled the chamber like water rising. Then Hawthorne stood. I move that we accept Lady Vance's testimony as credible and grant her immediate official protection under Crown authority. Seconded, Marsh said quietly. All in favor? 12 hands rose. Every single one. Alara's knees almost gave out. The motion carries. Pemberton's voice was formal now, official. Lady Alara Vance, you are hereby recognized as an official strategic consultant to the Crown, with all protections and authorities that entails. Any attempt to detain, harm, or interfere with your work will be treated as an act against Crown interests. Director Price stepped forward. We'll also be opening a formal investigation into Duke Nathaniel Vance's conduct. If the evidence supports fraud, he'll face appropriate consequences. What kind of consequences? Alara asked. Removal from advisory positions, potential criminal charges for fraud and attempted illegal detention, public censure. Price paused. And a very thorough examination of every decision he's made in the past 5 years to determine which ones actually came from him. It was everything she'd wanted, everything she'd fought for. So why did she feel like she'd just stepped off a cliff? There's one more thing, Pemberton said. The Duke will need to be informed of these developments, officially. We'll send a formal notice, but given the personal nature of this situation, we thought you might want to be present when he's told. You want me to confront him? We want to give you the choice. Pemberton's expression was carefully neutral. Some women in your position prefer to stay far away from their accusers. Others find value in witnessing accountability. Neither choice is wrong. Alara looked at Julian. He shook his head slightly, a warning, not a command. She looked at Victoria, who nodded once. Do it. I'll be there, Alara said. The meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening at the Duke's residence. Alara spent the intervening hours in a small office Price had assigned her, trying to process the fact that her life had fundamentally changed in the span of 3 hours. She was official now, protected, recognized. She was also about to face the man who'd spent 5 years stealing her work and had tried to destroy her when she threatened to expose him. Victoria brought her tea she didn't drink and food she couldn't eat. You don't have to do this, Victoria said quietly. No one would blame you for staying away. I would blame me. Alara looked up. I spent 5 years watching him take credit for my mind. I need to see his face when he realizes he can't anymore. It won't be satisfying, not the way you think it will. How do you know? Because I've done this. Victoria sat across from her. Different situation, same principle. The moment you prove they stole from you, they don't feel guilt. They feel rage. Rage that you dared to speak up, dared to prove them wrong, dared to exist as more than the role they assigned you. She paused. Be ready for that. At 5:30, a carriage arrived. Julian, Victoria, and Director Price accompanied her. The ride to Vance Manor felt surreal. Alara returning to the home she'd fled just days ago, but now flanked by official authority instead of running scared. The gates were closed. The guard recognized her, looked confused. Lady Vance, we were told you'd left. She has official business, Price said, showing credentials. Open the gates. They did. The manor looked the same. Nothing had changed except everything. Nathaniel was waiting in his study, because of course he was. He'd always conducted his most important meetings there, surrounded by the maps and books and strategic documents that represented his reputation. The reputation she'd built for him. He stood when they entered. He looked terrible, exhausted, furious, barely holding himself together. His eyes fixed on Alara with an expression that might have been relief or might have been murder. Alara, his voice cracked slightly. Thank heaven you're safe. I've been searching. Duke Vance, Director Price cut him off. We're here on official Crown business. Please sit down. Nathaniel's gaze flicked to Price, then to Julian, then to Victoria. Calculating, already trying to figure out the angles. What's this about? He asked carefully. It's about fraud. Price set a folder on the desk. We have credible evidence that you have been taking credit for strategic work created by your wife over the past 5 years. Work that has influenced military, economic, and political decisions at the highest levels of government. Nathaniel went very still. That's absurd. It's documented. Price opened the folder. We have the original analyses in Lady Vance's hand. We have the cipher ledger proving she created the encoding system. We have testimony from officials who can confirm discrepancies between your understanding of the strategies and the actual content. My wife is mentally unwell. Nathaniel's voice shifted to concern, practiced and smooth. I've been trying to get her help, but she's been resistant. This is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion Dr. Whitmore warned me about. Dr. Whitmore has recanted his preliminary assessment, Price said flatly. When informed that providing a medical opinion without examination could cost him his license, he became remarkably forthcoming about the nature of your arrangement. The color drained from Nathaniel's face. Furthermore, Price continued, we have documentation of your plan to have Lady Vance illegally committed. The hired men who attempted to detain her have been arrested and are currently providing very detailed testimony about who hired them and why. You can't. Nathaniel looked at Alara, really looked at her. You did this. You went to them. I proved what I created, Alara said quietly. That's all. You destroyed me. His voice was raw now, fury breaking through the careful composure. Everything I've built, you didn't build anything. The words came out harder than she'd intended. I built it. You just stood in front of it and smiled. Nathaniel slammed his hand on the desk. I gave you everything. A title, a home, status, security. You gave me a cage. Alara stepped forward. And then you took the one thing that was actually mine, my mind, and used it without permission, without credit, without acknowledgement, for 5 years. You're my wife. What's yours is mine. That's the law. Not anymore. Price's voice cut through the tension. Lady Vance has been granted official status as a Crown strategic consultant. Her work is now protected under Crown authority, and you, Duke Vance, are under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted illegal detention. Nathaniel stared at them. At her. The reality settling in slowly, like poison. You'll never survive this, he said to Alara. Society will destroy you. They'll call you a liar, a traitor, a woman who broke her marriage vows. Let them. Alara's voice was steady. I'd rather be called a liar by people who refuse to see the truth than be silenced by a man who couldn't survive without stealing my thoughts. I made you. You made nothing. She turned toward the door. You took what I created and wore it like a costume, and now everyone's going to know. Price gathered the folder. You'll receive formal notification of the investigation proceedings within 48 hours. I'd recommend securing legal counsel. They left him standing in his study, surrounded by the evidence of a reputation that was already crumbling. In the carriage, no one spoke for several minutes. Then Victoria said, How do you feel? Alara considered the question. She felt hollow, vindicated, but not satisfied, free, but not safe. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Julian was watching her carefully. That was brave. That was necessary. She looked out the window at the city passing by. What happens now? Now we prepare for the real fight, Price said. The Duke will challenge everything. He'll hire lawyers, call in favors, try to discredit your testimony. This goes public in 3 days when we present findings to the full court. You need to be ready for what comes after. I'm ready. But she wasn't, not really. Because 3 days later, when the findings went public, the backlash was worse than anything she'd imagined. The newspapers called her ambitious, conniving, a woman who'd destroyed her husband's honor to advance herself. Society turned on her with vicious efficiency, invitations rescinded, former friends crossing the street to avoid her, whispers following her everywhere she went. The Foreign Office protected her physically, but they couldn't protect her from being hated. 2 weeks after the announcement, someone threw a rock through the window of her temporary residence with a note attached. Traitor. Liar. You'll pay for destroying a good man. Alara sat in the dark, holding the rock, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The knock on her door came at midnight. She grabbed the pistol, always within reach now, and approached carefully. It's Julian. She opened the door. He looked exhausted, soaked from rain, and was holding a newspaper. You need to see this, he said. She took the paper. Front page, a letter to the editor signed by 17 women, all from prominent families. We write to offer our support to Lady Alara Vance, whose courage in exposing intellectual fraud has given voice to countless women whose work has been stolen, dismissed, or erased. We know her truth because we have lived it, and we stand with her against those who would rather see her silenced than admit that brilliance exists in forms they refuse to acknowledge. Below the letter, names Alara recognized, wives of politicians, sisters of military officers, women who'd spent their lives being decorative and silent while being anything but. She read it twice, then looked up at Julian. Victoria organized it, he said quietly. She reached out to every woman she knew who'd been in your position. Turns out there were a lot of them. This will make it worse for them, Alara whispered. Society will turn on them too. They know. They don't care. He stepped inside, closed the door. You're not alone in this. You never were. You just couldn't see the others until you stood up. Alara set down the paper carefully, like it might shatter. Then she started to plan. Not escape, not defense, war. If society wanted to call her a villain, she'd give them a villain. She'd expose every man who'd stolen from his wife, every fraud built on silenced brilliance, every career constructed on borrowed genius. She'd burn it all down. And 3 weeks later, standing in front of the royal court with evidence of 12 additional cases of intellectual theft, all documented, all verified, she did exactly that. But that was later. Right now, in the midnight quiet with rain hammering the windows, she looked at Julian and said, I need access to the full archives. Every strategic document submitted to the Crown in the last 20 years. Why? Because Nathaniel isn't the only one doing this, and I'm going to prove it. Julian stared at her. Then slowly, he smiled. I'll get you the access. Tonight? Tonight. They worked until dawn, pulling files, cross-referencing handwriting, identifying patterns of sudden brilliance that didn't match previous work. The evidence built like a storm. By sunrise, Alara had identified 8 other men whose strategic reputations had suspiciously improved after marriage. 8 wives whose intelligence had been stolen. 8 potential allies. She drafted letters to each of them, careful, coded, inviting them to coffee, to conversation, to the possibility of truth. 6 responded within a week. 4 agreed to meet. And sitting in a private room with 3 other women who'd lived her exact nightmare, watching them share their stories, their evidence, their rage, Alara finally understood what she'd actually done. She hadn't just saved herself, she'd started a revolution. But revolutions have costs, and hers was about to come due, because the day after that meeting, Nathaniel disappeared. And 2 days after that, Alara received a letter at the Foreign Office, delivered by anonymous courier. Inside, a single sentence in her husband's handwriting. If you don't withdraw your testimony, you'll never see Victoria Ashford alive again. The paper trembled in her hands, just slightly. Enough that Julian noticed. Let me see it. Alara passed him the letter, watched his face go hard as stone as he read the single sentence. Then he was moving, shouting for Price, for guards, for anyone with authority to mobilize a search. She stood frozen in the center of the office, her mind already 3 steps ahead and finding nothing but dead ends. Victoria had left the meeting 2 hours ago, said she had an errand to run. Alara hadn't thought twice about it because Victoria ran errands constantly, always moving, always working, always 10 places at once. Now she was gone, and Nathaniel had her. We need to find her, Julian was saying to Price, his voice clipped and urgent. Pull every resource we have. Check his known properties, associates, anyone who might be hiding him. He won't be anywhere obvious, Alara heard herself say. Her voice sounded distant, clinical. The part of her brain that solved problems had kicked in, overriding panic. He knows we'll search the obvious places. He'll be somewhere we wouldn't think to look. Price turned to her. Where? I don't know yet. She moved to the map on the wall, studying it like it held answers. But he's operating on desperation now. He's lost his reputation, his position, his credibility. This is revenge, not strategy, which means he's not thinking clearly. That makes him more dangerous, Julian said. It also makes him predictable. Alara traced a line across the map. He won't go far. He still thinks he can fix this, which means he needs to stay close enough to negotiate. And he chose Victoria specifically because she's been the most visible supporter. Taking her is meant to send a message. What message? That he can still hurt me. She turned from the map. He wants me to know he's willing to destroy anyone who helps me. It's intimidation. It's working, Julian muttered. No. Alara's voice sharpened. It's a mistake, because now we know exactly what he values most. Price frowned. What? Troll. He's been losing it piece by piece. His reputation, his influence, his ability to dictate the narrative. This is him trying to take it back, which means he'll want to watch it work. He'll want to see me panic, see me fold, see me choose Victoria's life over the truth. Will you? Price asked quietly.
The question hung there like a blade.
Alara thought about Victoria's fierce eyes, her uncompromising support, the way she'd stood in front of a room full of powerful men and declared Alara worth fighting for. Thought about the letter in the newspaper, the other women coming forward, the revolution that was just beginning to build momentum. I don't know, she said honestly, but I know Nathaniel expects me to, which gives us an advantage. How? Because he thinks I'll negotiate, which means he'll make contact again. And when he does, we trace it. Julian shook his head. That's too risky. If we spook him, if we don't engage, he might hurt her just to prove he's serious. Alara met his eyes. We need him to think he's winning, at least for now. Price considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded. What do you need? Time to think, and access to everything we know about where Nathaniel's been the past 3 weeks. They brought her files, financial records showing large cash withdrawals, reports from agents tracking his movements, sporadic, inconsistent, like he'd been deliberately trying to stay off the grid, and a list of properties connected to the Vance family, most of which had already been searched. Alara spread everything across the conference table and started looking for patterns. 3 hours later, she found one. Here, she pointed to a series of small transactions. He's been buying supplies, food, medical items, lamp oil, always in the same neighborhood, the warehouse district by the old port. Julian leaned over her shoulder. We searched that area. Found nothing. You searched Vance-owned properties, but look at this. She pulled up another document. 8 years ago, the Duke invested in a shipping venture with Lord Brennan. It failed. The company dissolved. But they still jointly owned the warehouse where the business was based. Brennan wouldn't help him, Price said. Not after the scandal. Brennan doesn't know. Alara tapped the paper. The property's been empty for years. No one's paying attention to it. And it's registered under the original company name, not the family names. We wouldn't have found it in a standard search. Price grabbed the documents, scanned them quickly. It's worth checking, but if you're wrong, then we've lost a few hours. But if I'm right, we find Victoria before Nathaniel realizes we're coming. Julian was already moving toward the door. I'll assemble a team. No. Alara caught his arm. A team will be obvious. He might be watching for that. We need to be quiet about this. You're not going, Julian said flatly. Yes, I am. Absolutely not. If he sees you, if he sees me, he'll think I'm there to negotiate, which is exactly what we want. She pulled away from him. I know him better than anyone. I know how he thinks, how he'll react. You need me there. Price stepped between them. She's right, but she doesn't go in alone. Small team, minimal visibility, and you stay back until we confirm Victoria's location. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. They left within the hour. Alara, Julian, Price, and 4 agents who moved like shadows and carried weapons they knew how to use. The warehouse district was exactly as bleak as Alara remembered. Crumbling buildings, broken windows, the smell of brine and rot from the nearby docks. The warehouse sat at the end of a dead-end street, its windows boarded, its door chained. It looked abandoned. But there was fresh mud by the side entrance, and a faint light visible through cracks in the boards. Price signaled the team. They spread out surrounding the building. Julian pulled Alara back behind a stack of crates. Stay here, he whispered. I will. He gave her a look that said he didn't believe her, then moved toward the entrance with 2 agents. Alara stayed put for exactly 90 seconds. Then she circled around the back of the building. She found the second entrance, a loading dock door slightly ajar. She could hear voices inside. Nathaniel's voice, tight with stress. Doesn't matter if they find us. She'll withdraw the testimony to save her friend. That's how women like her think. All sentiment, no strategy. Another voice, rougher. And if she doesn't, then we make an example. Nathaniel's voice turned cold. We show her what happens when people cross me. The other women who came forward will think twice after that. Alara's blood went ice cold. She slipped through the door into darkness that smelled like mildew and old timber. Let her eyes adjust. The voices were coming from an office at the far end. Door closed, lamplight spilling underneath. She moved toward it, each step calculated for silence. Then she heard Victoria. You're an idiot. Victoria's voice was rough, like she'd been shouting. You think kidnapping me helps you? You've just proven everything Alara said about you. You're desperate, incompetent, and so threatened by her intelligence that you'd rather destroy her than admit you needed her. The sound of a hand striking flesh. Victoria's sharp intake of breath. Alara's hand went to the pistol in her coat pocket. "Shut up," Nathaniel snarled. "You don't get to talk about intelligence. You're nothing. A woman playing at being important because your brother lets you pretend." "My brother doesn't let me do anything. I earned my position the same way Alara earned hers, through actual work, which is more than you've ever done." Another strike. Alara reached the door. Through the crack, she could see them. Victoria tied to a chair, blood at the corner of her mouth, her eyes blazing with defiance. Nathaniel standing over her, one hand raised. And two men near the window, hired muscle who looked uncomfortable but committed. She could wait for Julian and the team. Should wait. That was the smart play. But Victoria was bleeding, and Nathaniel was raising his hand again, and Alara stopped thinking strategically and started thinking tactically. She kicked the door open. Three things happened simultaneously. Nathaniel spun toward her, the two hired men reached for weapons, and Victoria kicked out hard, catching Nathaniel in the knee. He went down cursing. Alara had the pistol out and aimed before the hired men could clear their holsters. "Don't," she said quietly. They froze. Behind her, she heard running footsteps, Julian and the agents finally catching up. But for just a moment, it was her and Nathaniel facing each other across 5 years of stolen work and suppressed rage. He looked terrible, unshaven, disheveled, his eyes fevered with the kind of desperation that made men dangerous. "You came," he said, almost wonderingly. "I knew you would." "Let her go."
Or what? You'll shoot me? He laughed, the sound cracked and bitter. "You won't. You don't have it in you. You've spent your whole life being polite, being quiet, playing by rules that weren't designed for you. You're not a killer, Alara. You're just a woman who thought she was clever enough to take what belonged to me. Nothing belonged to you." Her hand didn't shake. "I created everything you claimed. Every strategy, every analysis, every decision that made people think you were brilliant. It was all me. And now everyone knows it." "They know you're a liar," he spat. "A bitter woman who destroyed her husband because he wouldn't give her the attention she craved. Is that what you tell yourself?" Alara took a step closer. "That I did this for attention? Not because you tried to have me imprisoned, not because you stole 5 years of my work, but because I wanted you to notice me. What else could it be? You had everything, title, wealth, status. I had a cage," her voice cut through his. "And you had a reputation built on theft. The difference is, I can prove what I am. You can't." Julian appeared in the doorway behind her, weapon drawn, agents fanning out to secure the room. One of them moved to untie Victoria, while another disarmed the hired men. Nathaniel looked around at the agents, at the weapons, at the absolute certainty of his defeat, and something in his face crumbled. "You've destroyed me," he whispered. "No." Alara lowered the pistol. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped pretending I hadn't noticed." Price stepped forward with restraints. "Duke Nathaniel Vance, you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, conspiracy, and fraud. You have the right to—" But Alara stopped hearing the words. She crossed to Victoria, who was being helped to her feet by one of the agents. "Are you all right?" Alara asked. Victoria touched her split lip, winced. "I've had worse. I'm sorry, this is my fault." "Don't!" Victoria's voice was firm despite the pain. "Don't you dare apologize for his choices. He did this, not you." They brought Victoria out first, then the hired men in restraints, then Nathaniel, who wouldn't look at Alara as they led him past. She stood in the empty warehouse as the team cleared out, feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. Julian found her there 10 minutes later. "We got him," he said unnecessarily. "I know. Victoria's going to be fine. Bruised, angry, but fine." "Good. You pulled a gun on your husband." "I did." "That was incredibly reckless." "I know that too." She turned to face him. "But it worked." Julian stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not cruel, not mocking, just amazed. "You're terrifying," he said. "Thank you." They rode back to the Foreign Office in silence. Victoria was already there, being examined by a physician who declared her injuries minor. She was arguing with him about whether she needed rest when Alara arrived. "I'm fine," Victoria insisted.
Stop fussing. You were kidnapped and assaulted, the physician said firmly. I need to finish what we started. Victoria looked past him to Alara. The other women, the ones we identified, have they agreed to testify? Victoria, you should rest. Have they? Victoria's voice sharpened. Alara pulled the latest correspondence from her bag. 5 have agreed. 2 more are considering. 1 refused outright, too afraid of the consequences. Then we work with 5. Victoria stood despite the physician's protests. We present a unified case. Multiple women, multiple patterns of theft. We show this isn't an isolated incident. It's systemic. Price appeared in his doorway. That's going to be complicated. Each case will need independent verification. So we verify them. Victoria looked at him steadily. We do the work. We prove it beyond doubt. And we make it impossible for anyone to dismiss this as one woman's vendetta. It'll take weeks, Price warned. Then we take weeks. Victoria's eyes were fierce despite the bruising. This is bigger than Alara's case now. This is about changing how intellectual work is valued and credited. This is about making it impossible for men to steal from their wives and call it marriage. Silence filled the room. Then Price nodded slowly. I'll authorize the resources, but we do this properly. Every piece of evidence documented, every claim verified, no shortcuts. Agreed, Victoria said. Over the next 3 weeks, they built a case that would reshape Crown policy on intellectual property. 5 women came forward with documentation. Cipher ledgers, original drafts, correspondence that proved their work had been stolen and rebranded. Each case was different in details, but identical in pattern. Brilliant women married to ambitious men. Work created in secret. Credit taken without acknowledgement. And when the women threatened to expose the truth, consequences that ranged from social isolation to threats of institutionalization. Alara coordinated the effort from a small office in the Foreign Ministry building. She interviewed each woman personally, helped them organize their evidence, showed them how to present their work in ways that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Some were angry, some were terrified. One broke down crying halfway through her testimony and had to be convinced not to withdraw. They'll hate me, she whispered. Society will never forgive this. Society has never valued us anyway, Alara said gently. At least this way we're hated for telling the truth instead of silenced for staying quiet. The woman, Lady Catherine Morrison, whose trade analyses had been claimed by her husband for 7 years, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Do you really believe it's worth it? I don't know yet, Alara admitted. But I know being invisible wasn't working, so we try something else. Catherine returned 2 days later with additional evidence and a steely determination that reminded Alara of herself. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for mid-November. 6 cases presented together. A consolidated accusation of systematic intellectual fraud. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, aristocrats, curious onlookers who wanted to see if the women would actually go through with it. Alara sat in the front row between Victoria and Julian, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their shaking. The prosecution presented first. Each woman took the stand, presented her evidence, explained in precise detail how her work had been stolen. Some were eloquent. Some stumbled. All were credible. Then the defense had their turn. They called character witnesses who described the women as unstable, emotional, prone to delusion. They presented doctors who testified about female hysteria and the tendency of women to exaggerate their contributions to household matters. They argued that collaboration between spouses was natural and that these wives were simply misunderstanding their roles. It was brutal, systematic, exactly what Alara had expected. Then the prosecution called their expert witness, Director Edmund Price. Price took the stand with the calm authority of someone who'd spent 40 years being listened to. The defense attorney approached him with visible confidence. Director Price, you've reviewed the evidence in these cases? I have. And in your professional opinion, is it possible these women are simply confused about the nature of their contributions? Price looked at the attorney like he'd asked if the sky was green. No, he said flatly. But surely, in a marriage, the line between individual work and collaborative effort can become blurred. Not like this. Price pulled out a document. I've examined the cipher system Lady Vance created. It's based on a rotating polyalphabetic substitution with embedded null values and positional encoding. That's not something you stumble into during a dinner conversation. That's advanced cryptographic theory. But her husband could have taught her. The Duke of Vance couldn't explain basic cryptographic principles when we interviewed him. He thought a Caesar cipher was named after a salad. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. Lady Vance, meanwhile, designed a system sophisticated enough that it took my best analysts 3 days to crack it. These aren't comparable skill levels. Perhaps she had help from someone else. Then she would still be the one who learned the skill, implemented the system, and created the work. Price's voice hardened. You can't accidentally create strategic analysis at this level. You can't stumble into trade policy that saves the crown millions. This isn't luck or collaboration. This is expertise. And the men who claimed it didn't possess that expertise before marriage, and haven't demonstrated it since. The attorney tried several more angles. Price demolished each one with the same methodical precision. When he stepped down, the defense looked significantly less confident. The trial continued for 6 more days. Expert after expert confirmed that the work was sophisticated, intentional, and far beyond what the husbands could have created independently. The cipher ledgers were authenticated, the timeline was verified, and slowly the narrative shifted. What had started as 6 bitter wives making accusations became 6 credible professionals proving systematic fraud. On the final day, Alara was called to testify one last time. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, and she could see him calculating, looking for the weak point, the emotional break, the moment where she'd crack and prove she was just an hysterical woman after all. "Lady Vance," he began, his tone almost sympathetic. "You've made very serious accusations against your husband, a man who gave you everything." "He gave me his name," Alara interrupted quietly. "I gave him his reputation. Those aren't equivalent. But you chose to remain silent for 5 years. Why should we believe you were being oppressed when you never spoke up?" "Because speaking up meant losing everything. My home, my freedom, potentially my life." She met his eyes. "You're asking why I didn't volunteer for destruction. The better question is why I had to choose between silence and survival. Many women manage to be both married and intellectually fulfilled without destroying their husbands. Many women have husbands who don't steal from them." Her voice stayed level. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic recognition that the work I created belongs to me. If that's destroying him, then what he built was already destruction, just aimed at me instead." The attorney tried to recover, but she could see she'd landed the blow. He switched tactics. "You stand to gain significantly from these accusations. A position in the Foreign Office, a salary, recognition. I stand to gain what I earned." Alara leaned forward slightly. "The work was always mine. I created it, I implemented it, I protected it. The only thing that's changed is who gets credit. If my husband had simply acknowledged my contributions, we wouldn't be here. But he chose theft over honesty. That was his decision, not mine." When she stepped down, the courtroom was silent. The verdict came 3 days later. The judges found in favor of the plaintiffs in all 6 cases. The husbands were stripped of positions gained through the fraudulent work, ordered to provide financial restitution, and banned from Crown service. 2 faced criminal fraud charges. More importantly, the Crown issued new guidelines on intellectual property within marriages. Work created by either spouse was to be credited to its creator. Theft of a spouse's intellectual work was now legally actionable, and women were granted the right to retain ownership of any systems, analyses, or creative work they could prove they'd originated. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Alara stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching journalists swarm the other women, and felt Julian appear beside her. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it." She looked at the women being interviewed, scared but standing straight, speaking their truths into recording devices that would carry their voices across the kingdom. They did it. What now? Good question. The Foreign Office had offered her a permanent position. Victoria wanted her to help establish a formal women's intelligence division. 3 universities had sent inquiries about establishing fellowships in her name. She had options, real ones. "Now I figure out who I am when I'm not hiding," Alara said. That night, there was a small celebration at Victoria's townhouse. The 6 women who'd testified, plus Julian, Price, and a handful of others who'd supported the case. It wasn't a party exactly, too much exhaustion for that, but it was acknowledgement. Catherine Morrison found Alara by the window.
Thank you, Catherine said quietly, for going first, for showing us it was possible. I'm sorry it was necessary. So am I. Catherine paused. My husband sent a letter. He wants to reconcile. Says he's sorry. He didn't understand how much the work meant to me. What did you say? I burned it. Catherine's smile was small but real. I'm done accepting apologies from men who only respect me after they've lost control of me. Alara raised her glass. I'll drink to that. Across the room, Victoria was holding court with 3 journalists, explaining the new intellectual property guidelines with the efficiency of someone who'd memorized the entire legal code. She caught Ilara's eye and winked. Julian appeared at Ilara's elbow with a fresh glass of wine. Price wants to see you tomorrow, Chit, he said. Official offer for the strategic analysis position. I know. Are you going to take it? Ilara considered the question. A month ago, she would have said yes immediately, grasped at any security, any recognition. Now she had the luxury of choosing. I think so, she said slowly. But on my terms, I want my name on my work. I want credit in real time, not retroactively. And I want authority to build a team, other women who've been told they're not smart enough for this kind of work. Julian smiled. Price expected that. He's already started drafting the position description. Good. They stood together watching the small gathering of people who'd fought for something bigger than individual cases, who'd proven that silence wasn't safety and that visibility, however dangerous, was sometimes necessary. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Victoria went to answer it, came back looking puzzled. Alara, there's someone here for you. Alara turned. Standing in the doorway, looking older and smaller than she remembered, was her mother. She hadn't seen her mother since the wedding, hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. The woman had cut contact when Alara married Nathaniel, disapproving of the match, disapproving of everything. Now she stood in Victoria's entryway, hands twisted together, her expression caught between pride and shame. Mother, Alara said carefully, I read about the trial. Her mother's voice was quiet. I needed to tell you that I was wrong about everything. I thought silence would protect you. I thought if you just accommodated him, did what was expected, you'd be safe. She looked up, her eyes wet. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Alara didn't know what to say. The anger she'd carried for 6 years was still there, but so was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or just exhaustion. You taught me to be smart, Alara said finally. You just didn't teach me that being smart was allowed. I didn't know it was. Her mother took a hesitant step forward. My generation, we were told our minds didn't matter, that cleverness in women was dangerous. I believed it. I'm sorry I made you believe it too. Stopped believing it. I know, I saw. A small, sad smile. You're braver than I ever was. They didn't embrace, didn't fall into easy reconciliation. But her mother stayed for an hour, listening to the other women tell their stories, and when she left, she squeezed Alara's hand. I'm proud of you, she whispered. It was more than Alara had expected, maybe more than she'd earned, but she took it. The celebration wound down near midnight. People drifted home, exhausted and victorious in equal measure. Alara was one of the last to leave. Julian walked her to her carriage. You know what the best part of this is? He said. What? Nathaniel thought destroying you would restore his power. Instead, it just proved everything you said about him was true. He's not a strategist. He's just a man who thought control looked like strength. What does strength look like? Julian considered this. I think it looks like you. Standing in a courtroom telling the truth, even when everyone wants you to lie. Building something new instead of protecting something broken. He paused. For what it's worth, I've never seen anyone fight like you fought. I wasn't fighting. Alara looked up at the stars, clear and cold above the city. I was just finally standing still long enough to be seen. The carriage took her to her new residence, a small apartment the Foreign Office had secured for her. Nothing like the manor, but entirely her own. She unlocked the door, lit a lamp, and sat at the desk by the window. On the desk, a blank ledger, fresh pages, space for new strategies, new ideas, new work that would carry her name from the first word. She opened it to the first page and wrote her name at the top,
Not Lady Vance, just Alara. Then she began to write. Outside, the city slept. Inside, a revolution continued one careful word at a time. And for the first time in 5 years, Alara wasn't invisible. She was just finally, impossibly herself.
The ink dried on the page while she slept at the desk, her hand still holding the pen. Morning found her with a stiff neck and 12 pages of analysis on trade route vulnerabilities that would reshape the kingdom's eastern border policy for the next decade. She stretched, wincing, and realized someone had draped a coat over her shoulders. Julian's coat. He must have checked on her at some point during the night. There was a note tucked into the pocket. Price wants you at the ministry by 9. Bring the eastern border analysis, if you've started it. J. She had 3 hours. Enough time to refine the work, make it bulletproof. By the time she arrived at the Foreign Office, she had 16 pages and a strategy that would save lives. Price read it standing at his desk, not sitting, the way he did when something demanded his full attention. This is good, he said finally. Better than good. When can you present it to the full Strategic Council?
Whenever they're ready to listen. Today, 2 o'clock. He set down the papers carefully. Fair warning, not everyone on the council is happy about your appointment. Some still think the trial was a mistake, that we're setting dangerous precedent by validating women's intellectual work. They'll be looking for any excuse to discredit you.
Let them look. Alara met his eyes. I've been discredited by experts. I'm still here. The council chamber was different in daylight. Less intimidating, more mundane, just a room full of men who'd spent their lives believing they deserved to be there. Alara walked in carrying her analysis and nothing else. No fear, no apology, no performance of anything except competence. General Hawthorne was already seated, along with Pemberton, Marsh, and 6 others whose names she knew from years of watching Nathaniel prepare for these meetings. Meetings where he'd present her work as his own while she waited at home, invisible and essential. Gentlemen, Price began, Miss Vance has prepared an analysis of our eastern border vulnerabilities. I think you'll find it addresses several gaps in our current defensive posture. Marsh leaned back in his chair. With respect, Director, we have experienced military analysts working on border security. I'm not sure what a civilian, a woman, could add to their assessments. Then let her present and find out, Hawthorne said flatly. The general had been one of her strongest supporters since the trial, probably because she'd made him look brilliant for 3 years, and he was practical enough to want that to continue. Alara moved to the front of the room, unrolled her maps, began to speak. She talked for 40 minutes about troop movements, supply lines, the psychological impact of border skirmishes versus the strategic reality. Explained how the current defensive posture was designed to prevent territory loss, but did nothing to address the underlying issue. Valdoria wasn't trying to take land. They were testing response patterns, mapping weaknesses, preparing for something larger. You're recommending we abandon defensive positions? One of the counselors asked, skeptical. I'm recommending we stop reacting and start anticipating. Alara pointed to 3 positions on the map. These are the next likely targets. If we reinforce them visibly, Valdoria adjusts their strategy. If we reinforce them quietly and let them attack where we're strongest, we capture their advance units and gain intelligence about their larger plans. That's risky, Marsh said. So is waiting for them to figure out our patterns and exploit them. Alara looked at him directly. Right now, we're playing defense against an opponent who's playing reconnaissance. We're answering different questions. That's how you lose wars before they start. Silence. Heavy and evaluating. Then Pemberton spoke, his voice careful. What you're proposing would require substantial resource reallocation, weeks of preparation. If you're wrong, then we've strengthened 3 border positions unnecessarily and spent resources on improved intelligence gathering. We're not worse off. She paused. But I'm not wrong. The pattern is clear. Valdoria has hit 7 different positions in 6 months, never the same sector twice, always withdrawing before engagement. That's not aggression, that's assessment. Hawthorne stood, moved to the map, studied it with the intensity of someone who'd spent 40 years reading terrain. The northern position here, why do you think they'll hit it next? Because it's the only major crossing they haven't tested, and because the garrison there was reduced 3 months ago to reinforce the southern border. They'll have noticed that through their intelligence network. How do you know the garrison was reduced? I read the troop movement logs. All of them. Alara met his eyes. I spent 5 years studying how this kingdom makes strategic decisions. I know which questions to ask. Something shifted in Hawthorne's expression. Respect, maybe, or just recognition of someone who did their work thoroughly. I'm authorizing the reinforcement, he said abruptly. Quiet deployment. We'll see if your assessment is accurate. General, we should discuss this with the full military council, Pemberton started. The full military council will take 3 weeks to reach consensus. We don't have 3 weeks. Hawthorne looked at Alara. How soon do you expect the attack? 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. Then we move now. He turned to the other council members. Unless someone has a better analysis? No one did. The meeting ended with Alara's recommendations approved and a timeline for implementation. As people filed out, Marsh approached her with the expression of someone swallowing something bitter. That was competent work, he said stiffly. Thank you. I still think this entire situation has been handled poorly. The trial, the public spectacle, the way the Duke was treated. The Duke kidnapped a woman and tried to have his wife institutionalized, Alara said quietly. How should that have been handled? Marsh's mouth tightened. Perhaps with more discretion, less vindictiveness. It wasn't vindictive. It was necessary. She held his gaze. You can disapprove of the method all you want, Sir Frederick, but the work I just presented is stronger than anything the Duke produced in 5 years. You know it. I know it. And I suspect deep down he knows it too. She walked past him before he could respond. In the corridor, Julian was waiting. How did it go? I'm reinforcing the eastern border, quietly. He grinned. So, well, we'll see in 2 weeks. They did see. 12 days later, Valdoria hit the northern crossing with 3 times the force they'd used in previous skirmishes. They struck hard, fast, expecting the reduced garrison to fold quickly. Instead, they ran straight into reinforced positions and a coordinated counterattack that cut off their retreat. The kingdom captured 47 Valdorian soldiers, 3 officers, and a strategic plan that detailed the next 6 months of planned incursions. Hawthorne himself brought Alara the report. You were right, he said simply. Every detail, timing, location, force composition, all of it. I'm glad it worked. I'm recommending you for a permanent seat on the Strategic Council, not as an advisor, as a full member. He paused. There will be objections, precedent, tradition, all the usual excuses. But the king trusts results, and you've delivered results. The appointment came through 3 weeks later. Alara became the first woman to hold a permanent position on the kingdom's Strategic Council. The announcement made front-page news. Half the kingdom celebrated. The other half declared it the beginning of civilization's collapse. Alara ignored both reactions and got back to work. But the real confrontation came on a cold January morning, 6 months after the trial, when she received a letter requesting a meeting. The letter was from Nathaniel. He was being held at a secure facility pending resolution of the criminal fraud charges. The trial had been delayed twice, his lawyers arguing procedural issues, trying to wear down the prosecution's resolve. Alara stared at the letter for a long time before showing it to Julian. You don't have to respond, he said immediately. I know. He has no power over you anymore, no leverage, no authority, nothing. I know that too. She reread the letter. It was brief, formal, requesting 30 minutes of her time. No explanations, no justifications, just a request. What do you think he wants? Julian asked. I don't know. That's why I'm considering it. It could be a manipulation. One last attempt to what? I've already taken everything he valued. His reputation, his position, his credibility. What's left to take? Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, his dignity. His ability to lie to himself about what happened. Then maybe it's time he stopped lying. She agreed to the meeting, 1 hour, supervised, in a neutral location. No negotiation, no deals. They met in a small office at the Foreign Ministry building. Nathaniel sat on one side of a desk, Alara on the other, with 2 guards stationed by the door, and Julian visible through the window in the corridor. He looked different, thinner, older. The confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by something hollowed out and uncertain. They sat in silence for almost a minute. Then Nathaniel spoke. I wanted to see you, he said quietly. Why? Because I needed to understand. He looked at his hands. For 5 years, I thought I was brilliant. Every strategy, every decision, I believed they came from me, that I'd earned everything I achieved. They didn't. You hadn't. I know that now. His voice cracked slightly. But at the time, I couldn't see it. The ideas would just appear. In my notes, in the documents I was reviewing, and I'd think, yes, this is right. This is what I should do. I never questioned where they came from. Because you didn't want to question it, Alara said flatly. You liked believing you were exceptional. Yes. The admission seemed to cost him. I liked the praise, the recognition, the way people looked at me like I'd accomplished something extraordinary. And when I realized the strategies were too sophisticated, too detailed to have come from me, when I started to suspect you were involved, I convinced myself it didn't matter, that collaboration was natural, that you were my wife, so anything you created was partially mine anyway. That's not how it works. I know. He looked up and his eyes were raw. When did you start hating me? The question surprised her. She'd expected anger, justification, maybe pleading. Not this. I never hated you, she said slowly. Hate requires caring about someone enough to want them diminished. I just stopped seeing you as relevant. You became an obstacle instead of a person. He flinched. That's worse. Is it? Yes. Because hate means I still mattered. Even as an enemy, I mattered. He leaned back in his chair. But you just moved around me like I was furniture, something to be managed and worked around. Because that's what you were. Alara's voice stayed level. You weren't my partner. You weren't my collaborator. You were the person standing between me and recognition for my own work. So I managed you the same way I managed any other obstacle. I never understood how smart you were, Nathaniel said quietly. Not really. I genuinely thought you were clever, good with details, helpful in a supportive kind of way. I didn't realize you were better than me at the thing I'd built my entire identity around. Would it have mattered if you had? He considered this. I don't know. Maybe I would have been threatened enough to stop you earlier. Or maybe I would have actually valued it. I like to think I would have valued it, but he shook his head. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. Alara studied him across the desk. This man who'd stolen 5 years of her life, who'd tried to have her erased when she threatened his comfortable fraud. He looked broken now, defeated. She felt nothing. Why did you really ask to see me? She asked. Because I need to know if you ever loved me, even at the beginning, even for a moment. His voice dropped. Or if I was always just a means to an end. The honesty of the question caught her off guard. She could lie, could tell him what he wanted to hear, but she'd spent 5 years lying for his benefit. I tried to love you, she said finally. When we married, I tried. I thought maybe we could build something real. But you never saw me. You saw a Duchess, a decoration, someone to make you look stable and respectable while you built your career. She paused. The moment I realized you'd never actually see me, the real me, was the moment I stopped trying. When was that? 3 months after we married. You came home excited about a strategy you'd just presented. It was mine, word for word mine, and you were so proud, so thrilled with yourself. I waited for you to mention me, to say, my wife suggested this, or even, I had help with this. But you never did. You genuinely believed you'd created it. She met his eyes. That's when I understood. You didn't just take my work. You erased me from my own thoughts. And that's when I stopped being your wife and started being your strategist. I'm sorry. I don't care. The words came out flat, factual. Your apology doesn't change anything. It doesn't give me back 5 years. It doesn't undo the fear I felt when you tried to have me institutionalized. It's just words from a man who's finally facing consequences. What do you want from me? He asked. Punishment? Revenge? What would actually satisfy you? Alara thought about it. What did she want? I want you to understand that brilliance isn't ownership, she said slowly, that my mind never belonged to you no matter what the law said about marriage. I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that everything you valued about yourself was borrowed, that you're not actually exceptional. You're just mediocre enough to steal from someone exceptional and call it talent. She leaned forward. But most of all, I want you to become irrelevant. I want to build things so significant, so undeniably mine, that you become a footnote in my story. The man I escaped from, nothing more. The guard shifted by the door. Time was almost up. Nathaniel's hands shook slightly. I destroyed you. Everything you had, everything you could have been. No. Alara stood. You tried to destroy me. There's a difference. I'm still here. I'm on the Strategic Council. I'm doing work that matters, under my own name, with full recognition. You destroyed your own reputation. I just stopped protecting it. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. The strategies I created for you, they'll be studied for years. Military academies will teach them. They'll analyze the tactical brilliance, the innovative thinking, the way they reshaped strategic doctrine. She looked back at him. And every single one will be credited to me now. Not us, not collaborative effort. Me, my name, my work. That's what you actually lost. Not your reputation. The ability to steal mine. She left him sitting there, small and defeated, and finally, completely powerless. Julian was waiting in the corridor. How was it? He asked. Final. Alara kept walking. I don't need to see him again. Good. They emerged into pale winter sunlight. The city moved around them with the efficient chaos of a place that had already moved past last season's scandal and onto new dramas. Price wants to discuss the Valdorian intelligence, Julian said. And there's a request from the university to guest lecture on strategic analysis. When? Lectures next month. Intelligence briefings this afternoon. Normal things, work things. The kind of routine that meant she'd actually built a life beyond survival. Let's handle the intelligence first, Alara said. Then, I need to review the spring budget allocations. I think there's inefficiency in the supply chain that... Julian laughed. You're going to revolutionize the supply chain now. Someone should. She smiled slightly. It's wasteful, and I don't like waste. 3 months later, she stood at a podium in the largest lecture hall at the Royal Academy, looking out at 300 students who'd come to hear her speak about strategic thinking. Most were men. A few dozen were women who'd fought their families for the right to attend, who sat in the front rows taking notes with fierce concentration. Alara didn't give them theory, didn't give them abstract principles or philosophical frameworks. She walked them through actual decisions. The Eastern Border reinforcement, the Valdorian intelligence capture, a trade negotiation that had saved the kingdom £500,000 in tariff adjustments. She showed them her working process, how she gathered information, how she identified patterns, how she tested assumptions against reality, the mistakes she'd made, the corrections she'd implemented. Strategy isn't magic, she told them. It's not genius or inspiration or natural talent. It's work. It's looking at the same information everyone else sees and asking different questions. It's being willing to be wrong and adjust. It's understanding that the smartest person in the room is usually the one who's done the most homework. A young woman raised her hand. How do you deal with people not taking you seriously? Because you're a woman? Alara looked at her. 19, maybe 20, brilliant eyes and anxious posture. Herself, 6 years ago. I prove them wrong, she said simply. I do work so good they can't ignore it. And when they try to ignore it anyway, I make it public. I create a record they can't erase. She paused. But here's the thing. You don't do this for their recognition. You do it because the work matters. Because problems need solving and you can solve them. If recognition comes, great. If it doesn't, the work still mattered. But doesn't that mean letting them win? Another student asked. If you create the work and they take credit, they can take credit all they want. Credit is just narrative. The work itself is truth, and truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Alara thought about the cipher ledger, the trial, the moment when lies stopped being sustainable. Your job is to create truth that's so solid, so documented, so undeniable that when it surfaces, no one can dismiss it. The lecture ran over by 30 minutes. Students stayed after, asking questions, sharing their own experiences with intellectual theft or dismissal. The women especially, telling stories of ideas attributed to male colleagues, of work stolen by advisors, of brilliance systematically erased. Alara listened to all of them, gave what advice she could. And when they asked if it got better, she told them the truth. It gets different. You get stronger. You get smarter about protecting your work. You find allies. You build systems that make theft harder.
She looked around at their young, determined faces. But the fight doesn't end. It just changes shape. The question is whether you're willing to keep fighting. They were. She could see it in their eyes. 6 months after that, the Women's Strategic Institute opened its doors. Victoria ran it with ruthless efficiency, recruiting women with analytical minds and no traditional outlets for their talents. The curriculum covered everything from cryptography to economic policy to military tactics. Alara taught one course a term, always full, always waiting list. The men who'd opposed her appointment to the Strategic Council slowly, grudgingly, began to accept her presence. Not because they'd changed their minds about women's capabilities, but because she kept being right, kept delivering analysis that saved lives and money and political capital. After a while, it became easier to listen to her than to explain why they'd ignored her advice and been wrong. A year after the trial, the kingdom's strategic doctrine was rewritten. 3 of the core principles came directly from Alara's work. Her name was on the document, in large print, impossible to miss. Nathaniel's fraud trial finally concluded after 18 months of delays. He was found guilty on multiple counts, stripped of his title, sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanent ban from Crown service. Alara didn't attend the sentencing. She was busy with a border negotiation that actually needed her attention, but Victoria sent her a note. "It's over. He's irrelevant now. You won." Alara read it once, filed it away, and went back to work. Winning wasn't the point. It had never been the point. The point was building something real, something undeniably hers. 2 years after the trial, she received a letter from Catherine Morrison. Catherine had taken her case victory and turned it into a consulting practice, helping other women document and protect their intellectual work. The practice was thriving. "I've helped 43 women in the past year," Catherine wrote. "Every single one of them mentioned your name, said you made this possible, thought you should know." Alara kept that letter, framed it actually, and hung it in her office at the Foreign Ministry, not because she needed validation, but because it was evidence that the fight had been worth it. On a spring morning 3 years after everything changed, Alara woke in her apartment, made coffee, and reviewed the day's agenda. 2 meetings, a briefing, an analysis deadline for the Trade Council. Normal day, normal work. She was halfway through her coffee when someone knocked. She opened the door to find Julian holding a newspaper and looking somewhere between amused and impressed. "You made international news," he said. She took the paper. Front page of the Valdorian Times. "Kingdom Strategic Reforms Reshape Regional Balance of Power, Chief Architect Alara Vance." The article detailed how her work over the past 3 years had influenced not just the kingdom's strategy, but forced neighboring countries to adapt. Valdoria had restructured their entire military approach. 3 other nations had hired strategic consultants specifically to counter her analyses. "You've become a problem for our enemies," Julian said. "Congratulations." "I've become effective." She set down the paper. "That's different." "Is it? Being a problem means they're reacting to me personally. Being effective means they're reacting to good strategy." She smiled slightly. "I prefer the latter." He studied her with that expression he got sometimes, part admiration, part concern. "You know you've fundamentally changed how this kingdom approaches strategic planning, right? Women at the academy, women in intelligence, women in policy positions, none of that existed before you. It would have existed eventually. I just accelerated the timeline." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Minimize what you accomplished." He moved closer. "You didn't just save yourself. You changed the entire system. That matters." Alara looked at him, this man who'd helped her when he had every reason to walk away, who'd believed her when belief was dangerous, who'd become something she hadn't expected, a friend. Maybe more than that, though neither of them had named it yet. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of it, for staying. Where else would I be?" He shrugged. "Besides, someone has to keep you from working yourself to death. You've gotten worse since the promotion." "I've gotten busier." "Same thing." They had coffee together while she finished reviewing the briefing notes. Easy silence, comfortable. When he left for his own meetings, Alara returned to her desk and the blank ledger waiting there. 3 years of entries now. 3 years of work that bore her name, her signature, her undeniable authorship. She opened to the next blank page and began to write. The analysis was complex, a restructuring of supply routes that would improve efficiency by 18% while reducing costs. It would take weeks to fully develop. But she had time now, had security, had the freedom to think as far ahead as necessary. At sunset, she stopped writing and looked out the window at the city below. Lights beginning to glow in windows. People heading home after ordinary days. She'd spent 5 years invisible in this city, spent another 3 becoming impossible to ignore. Now she was just present, working, building, creating things that mattered under her own name. It wasn't perfect. There were still men who dismissed her, still society women who refused to acknowledge her, still whispers about the woman who'd destroyed her husband, who'd broken the natural order, who'd gotten above herself. She didn't care anymore, hadn't cared for a long time, because the work was real, the changes were real. The women who came after her, who didn't have to fight as hard because she'd fought first, they were real. That was enough, more than enough. On a cold evening in December, 4 years after the trial, Victoria hosted a dinner for the women who'd testified. All 6 of them, plus the network they'd built. 23 women now working in strategic positions across the kingdom. They gathered in Victoria's dining room, which was too small for this many people, but no one cared. Catherine raised a glass. To Ilara. Who went first? To all of us, Ilara corrected. Who went together? They drank. Talked late into the night about work, about challenges, about the slow grinding progress of changing systems that didn't want to change. Near midnight, Victoria pulled Ilara aside. I need to tell you something, Victoria said. The university is establishing a chair in strategic studies. They want to name it after you. Ilara stared. I'm not dead. They're aware. They think you've contributed enough to warrant it anyway. Victoria smiled. The Vance Chair in Strategic Analysis. It'll fund research and provide scholarships for women entering the field. Not the Vance Chair, Ilara said immediately. I never want that name associated with my work again. What name, then? She thought about it. About the woman she'd been, invisible and essential. About the woman she'd become, visible and free. The Ilara Chair, she said finally. Just Ilara. That's who did the work. The chair was established 6 months later. The first recipient was a young woman from the provinces who'd taught herself cryptography from library books and had nowhere to study it formally. Ilara met her during the scholarship ceremony. Thank you, the girl whispered, for making this possible. You made it possible, Ilara told her, by being smart enough to teach yourself. I just opened a door. You're the one walking through it. 5 years after the trial, Ilara stood in the same council chamber where she'd first presented evidence of Nathaniel's fraud. But this time she wasn't defending herself. She was presenting a comprehensive reformation of the kingdom's intelligence apparatus, a system she'd designed from foundation to execution. The king himself attended the presentation. When she finished, he stood. Miss Vance, he said formally, your service to this kingdom has been extraordinary. Your insights have prevented wars, saved countless lives, and fundamentally improved our strategic capabilities. It is therefore my honor to offer you the position of Chief Strategic Advisor to the Crown. The room went silent. Chief Strategic Advisor. The highest civilian strategic position in the kingdom. Authority over all military and economic planning. Direct access to the king. Ilara looked at the king, at the council members watching with mixed expressions of respect and resentment, at Julian standing near the door, grinning like an idiot. I accept, she said clearly, on one condition. The king raised an eyebrow. Which is? That the position is open to women permanently, not as an exception, as policy. She held his gaze. I don't want to be a singular achievement. I want to be the beginning of normal. The king considered this, then nodded. Agreed. The appointment was announced the next day. Half the kingdom celebrated. The other half declared it proof of moral decay. Ilara ignored both and got to work. On a spring morning, 6 years after everything changed, she woke in her apartment, larger now, better furnished, but still modest by aristocratic standards, and realized she was happy. Not perfectly happy. Not without complications or challenges or moments of doubt, but genuinely, substantially, undeniably happy. She made coffee, reviewed the day's agenda. 3 meetings, a budget presentation, Dinner with Julian that might or might not be a date, depending on whether either of them acknowledged it as such. The morning paper had a feature on the Women's Strategic Institute's latest graduating class. 42 women entering positions across government, military, and private sector. Every single one of them qualified, documented, ready to prove their worth. The article mentioned Laura briefly, the woman who changed everything. She read it once, then used the paper to line her trash bin. She hadn't changed everything. She just stopped being invisible. The rest, the women who came after, the systems that adapted, the slow grinding progress toward recognition, that was collective work, shared victory. Her contribution was just going first and refusing to disappear. That evening, over dinner that was definitely a date, even if neither of them said so, Julian asked her something he'd been circling for months. Do you ever regret it? The trial, the exposure, everything that came after? Alara considered the question seriously. I regret that it was necessary, that the system was so broken I had to burn my entire life down to be seen as human. She paused. But I don't regret doing it, because the alternative was worse. Which alternative? Staying invisible, safe and silent, and slowly erasing myself to make someone else comfortable. She looked at him. I'd rather be hated for being real than loved for being convenient. Julian reached across the table, took her hand. For what it's worth, I think you're extraordinary. I'm competent. There's a difference. No. His voice was firm. You're both. You're competent enough to do the work, and extraordinary enough to have done it while everyone was trying to stop you. She squeezed his hand. Let herself believe him. They stayed at the restaurant until it closed, talking about work and future and the stubborn persistence of hope in the face of systemic resistance. When he walked her home, he kissed her at the door, gentle and questioning and full of possibility. Is this okay? He asked. It's better than okay, she said. And it was. 7 years after the trial, Alara Vance stood on a platform in the largest assembly hall in the kingdom, addressing a crowd of 500 women who'd come to hear her speak at the annual Women's Leadership Conference. She looked out at their faces, young and old, hopeful and tired, brilliant and hungry for recognition, and felt the weight of being first. I'm not going to tell you it's easy, she began. I'm not going to promise that if you work hard enough, if you're smart enough, if you prove yourself thoroughly enough, people will automatically recognize your worth. She paused, because that's not how it works. The system isn't designed to see us. It's designed to use us quietly and credit us never. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the audience. But here's what I will tell you. You can build anyway. You can create work so solid, so documented, so undeniably yours that it becomes impossible to erase. You can find allies. You can protect each other. And you can refuse, absolutely refuse, to disappear just because disappearing is easier. She talked for an hour. About strategy, about documentation, about the unglamorous work of creating change, one careful decision at a time. And when she finished, the applause was thunderous. Afterward, women lined up to speak with her, to share their stories, to ask advice. One of them was a girl no more than 16, thin and nervous, and clutching a notebook. I want to study cryptography, she whispered, but my parents say it's not appropriate for women. Show me your work, Alara said. The girl opened the notebook. Inside, pages of code, cipher systems, cryptographic analyses that would have impressed Julian's entire department. This is exceptional, Alara said quietly. How long have you been studying? 3 years, in secret. Apply to the Women's Strategic Institute. Use my name as a reference. If they don't accept you, I'll hire you myself. The girl's eyes filled with tears. Really? Really. Talent like this doesn't wait for permission, and neither should you. She watched the girl walk away, hope straightening her spine, and thought about the cost of going first. The fear, the exposure, the years of fighting just to be seen as human. Worth it, she thought, every bit of it. That night, alone in her office at the Foreign Ministry, Alara opened her ledger to the final page. 7 years of entries, 7 years of strategies, analyses, victories, and defeats. She wrote one last entry. The work continues, the fight continues, but I am no longer fighting alone. And that, finally, is victory. She closed the ledger, filed it carefully with the others. Tomorrow, there would be new problems to solve,
new strategies to develop, new women to mentor, and new battles to fight. But tonight she allowed herself something she'd earned but rarely acknowledged: pride. She had been invisible. Then she had been impossible to ignore. Now she was simply herself, brilliant, flawed, essential, and free. The legend of the Duke faded into footnotes and cautionary tales. The woman no one had noticed became the woman who rewrote everything. And the world shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to matter, enough to last, enough to be worth fighting for. Alara stood at her window, looking out at the city that had tried to erase her and failed, and smiled. The work was never finished, but it was hers, entirely, undeniably, irrevocably hers. And that was everything.